Hey guys, it's Self-Dev and I'm back with another video. So in this video I wanted to talk about the inferior function. Um, so basically I used to think that the top four functions in someone's function stack were all important to grow in terms of self-development. But I've been thinking about how the inferior function, the last function in the ego stack, so that's the top four functions, it may not actually be as important to self-develop as I thought. So basically, you could pretty much live life just fine using your top three functions. Now, some people only use the top two functions as something that they really need to use in order to get by in life. Um, and maybe they can. I'm not saying that they can't, but how the child function works is often something to use in play to have a rest from the somewhat exhausting top two functions. So I would probably recommend you would at least use the top three functions, just so you have more of an adaptability to what happens in your life, which you could easily just end up into that you hadn't have expected to happen. So yeah, you might be in a living circumstances where you find you don't really need to use the usefulness of the fourth function. Um, so either maybe the town you live in, um, maybe you are an INTP or an ISTP with FE inferior, and the people you are living around in your town are maybe not friendly, or maybe you don't really click with them in terms of interests or hobbies. Maybe there just aren't many people around in your town and they're all pretty isolated and not really sociable. So that can kind of lean towards the idea that you might not really need to use your FE inferior very much. You could be a TI inferior, so ESFJ and ENFJ, and you might be in a career which is something that is less intellectual, that needs less ways that you need to break down logic or show proof about things. An example might be maybe the stereotype of ESFJs hosting parties and stuff. That's not really something that I would see as needing sciencey proof and logic. So that's an example of what I mean there. Maybe life coaching might not really need a lot of logic. Honest, obviously, there's a lot of ways you could life coach someone. I personally think that logic is quite useful. You can make logical arguments for why something is a good or not so good idea, and I think that can help someone think about if they should actually do something or not. Obviously, it's up to the actual person as to what they think is useful or not in life coaching. Um, yeah, so that's my first point. Not really seeing value in the last function. Obviously, as I said, life circumstances can change. you might be forced to change your career, to change where you live, to change your social circles. And yeah, that could mean that you will have to develop your inferior function. So overall, I would say you should try and develop your inferior function. I have sort of developed a little theory in my mind. I haven't really written anything down yet, but there seems to be a trend of how the inferior function can grow. I've also found out that there's a lot of inconsistencies with other people's attitude towards it, and that kind of helped me realize that there are a lot of stages with how the inferior function evolves, and not everyone will even feel the need to pass through these stages. So yeah, I will probably have to spend a lot of time thinking and researching other people's attitude to the inferior function, so I don't have a load of people going, I don't relate to my inferior function working like this. And I'll just have to say, well, there are all sorts of stages with how the inferior function works, and opinions on whether or not someone finds it useful or not, or someone finds it quite opposing to probably their hero function, their primary function, because there's quite a space between the hero and the inferior function, and it can take a while before the person realizes that they can use these two functions to improve how the hero function works and operates, to make sure that the hero function is working at a more higher efficient capacity than it was before they tried to use the inferior function. Yeah, I think that's most of my points. Yeah, it's probably easier to develop your inferior function sooner rather than later. That's just my opinion. If you find out that you're in your like 30s or 40s or later, and only then you realize that you kind of really need to develop your inferior function, and it turns out that you can develop it just fine, and a case of waiting until you're older is not actually an issue for you, and that's great. But if you're young now, not everyone seems to agree on when and how the different functions develop. I would say the average age for the inferior function to develop is around late teens to early 20s, or maybe mid 20s. Obviously, it depends on, as I said, the life circumstances. There might not be any real trigger that will awaken the awareness or the idea that the inferior function is useful. So there is that. If you were watching this video and you realize that, oh, maybe I'm seeing the inferior function as inferior, and I'm realizing that I might need to use it, or at least be aware of it later in life, how would I go about seeing its usefulness? Because right now I don't see it as useful. And what I would say has helped me is I tend to watch and read a fair amount of content that is made by high TI users, which is my inferior. And that really helps me see how the function is useful. And I think it would probably help if you did similar things, if you saw and observed how that those with types with higher of the function that is your inferior, and then you could see just how useful it actually is. Yeah, I think that's just about all I have to say. I will probably make a lot of future videos about the inferior function. It's a super misunderstood function. It's something that might be confused with the blind spot function. And I do think that, especially when you're younger, so if you're a teenager or you're younger than a teenager, you might not display any of an inferior function. And if you're trying to type someone who is this sort of age, then you might confuse the absence of this inferior function with the absence of it as a blind spot function, or maybe a nemesis function, the fifth function, or maybe the eighth function. So honestly, I suppose that's another point. You shouldn't really be too confident when it comes to trying to type other people who are quite young and have not matured their functions. Although I do understand that some people are just easier to type, have more obvious signs, tick loads and loads of boxes, and you don't really need to look into it too much. Yeah. I hope you found this useful. Please let me know your experiences of how you have used your inferior function, or how you have seen other people's inferior function. I would love to know your stories and experiences, and it would also help me understand more about typology and functions in general. Yeah, that's pretty much the end of this video. Please like, subscribe, comment. What did you like? What did you not like? What could be improved? I love to improve my content. Was I wrong in anything? That sometimes happens. It's just inevitable. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I hope you have an awesome day and an amazing life.